When questioning what makes an effective villain, we tend to limit ourselves and think within the box by assuming that there's a checklist of requirements that need to be met before a character can be considered good. It's often thought that they need to be realistic and show glimpses of their humanity, or that they need to have an extensive background, or that they have to have a unique personality. And while characteristics like this often help to make villains good characters, the truth is that they're just byproducts of a much simpler rule. This rule being that the villain needs to be written in service of the narrative. A villain can be amazingly crafted and complex if you look at them in a vacuum, but that doesn't necessarily equate to being a good villain in relation to their story. On the other hand, some villains can be very rudimentary, but if they service the story effectively, then that doesn't matter. Final Fantasy VII Sephiroth has a subdued personality and hardly even speaks, but his backstory, motivations, and how they tie in with the world are integral to a game with such a heavy plot and setting focus. Chrono Trigger's Lavos is just an alien parasite set on draining the world's energy. It has no characterization and it's actually more of a force of nature than a character, but it's one of the most narratively powerful villains in gaming history because of how it served as a stimulant for the game's plot, themes, and character growth. A villain is good if they're written well if they enhance the narrative, and what enhances the narrative is dependent on the story. So there's endless potential when it comes to this sort of thing. Having a deep backstory and an enticing personality usually helps, but those traits alone don't make a villain good and border on redundancy if they don't serve the narrative in any way. So what could possibly make an amoral, serial murderer with very little backstory and a monotone personality one of the most well-conceived and thematically rich characters in his story? Well, good writing. But it takes some very good writing and a very strange story for such a weird character concept to work. So I suppose it's a good thing that we're talking about Hunter x Hunter. The initial draw of a character like Chrollo Lucilfer is a simple one. He is an enigma. There's no clear evidence of him being an exceptionally complex or deep character, but he's shrouded in uncertainty, and this gives him an alluring potential. He has an ominous, powerful aura about him, and he's permeated by this indescribable feeling of something deeper. That there's more to him than meets the eye, but that this aspect of him is difficult to uncover. There's a reason that he's one of the most discussed characters in the series. Simply put, he's a mystery. Humans simultaneously fear and are drawn in by the unknown. We seek the deepest truths, but are terrified of what those truths may be. It's endless potential, and when a character seems to personify that, it's exciting. But the truth is, while Chrollo does represent the unknown, he is not directionless. He's written in such a way that even if he is a completely ambiguous entity, little hints in his behavior and actions allow us to make educated inferences about the type of man that he is. While one could accuse Togashi of being indulgent when it comes to certain characteristics of his writing, he excels at using his most important characters in moderation. Togashi knows that the readers are naturally curious, so he structures his use of certain characters with that tendency in mind to build an intrigue around them. And Chrollo is a great example of building gravitas and an aura around a character through a lack of exposure and through withholding information, while giving just enough away to hint at the true nature of said character. Chrollo is not very fleshed out, and his personality is nowhere near as striking as some of the other characters in this series. What usually sells him to people at first is his impressive character design, his dark and edgy demeanor, and his badassery in combat. But there is this moment that completely drew me in and made me realize that this was a character that warranted a deeper examination. This moment could just be interpreted as a cheap writing ploy to make the spider seem more sympathetic, but I truly think that there is much more to it. A more cohesive, grand idea for this character that is first obvious here. The more you think about Chrollo, the more interesting he is. He seems at first like a generic reserved badass villain with a cool design, but there are little hints scattered throughout his appearances in the series that add up to tell you exactly what he's about. At face value, he's just a dark head of a band of murderers who cries when his comrades die because that adds a bit of depth to the troupe. It would seem that he's written as such because that's just how you write a functional villain and a leader of a villainous group. But the truth is that Chrollo is a stroke of characterization genius. His personality, background information, and narrative role all integrated seamlessly with the themes of the Phantom Troop itself and the York New arc as a whole. While he does bring some completely new ideas to the series that we'll talk about later, what's most significant regarding Chrollo is that everything about him is woven in with the Spider and its members so tightly that the moment you uncover something about the troop, you simultaneously discover something about Chrollo, and vice versa. It is exceptional integrative storytelling when it comes to theme communication, with these moments almost subconsciously telling us exactly who this man is. It's so effective that the audience clearly understands what the troop are all about and that Chrollo is more substantial than he seems, but so subtle that the nature of the head of the Spider is completely mysterious, unless examined very closely. The first thing to establish here is that Chrollo cares for his fellow troop members. This may seem obvious, but some tend to believe that Chrollo is a cold psychopath who uses the Spider members purely for personal gain and doesn't actually care for anyone but himself. And while he is deceptively selfish, for reasons we'll get into in a bit, the notion that he doesn't care for others is incorrect. The nature of that care is unorthodox, but the strength of it is undeniable. And the evidence of Chrollo's love for the troop is there for all to see. He may have committed remorseless, evil actions and caused countless deaths, but as is the case with the rest of the Spider, that does not mean that he is unfeeling. In fact, quite the opposite is true. His fellow troop members are the most important things in the world to him, and he cares deeply for them. We need look no further than the scenes where he grieves the death of Uvo and ponders whether Uvo is experiencing an afterlife, or his recent appearance in the manga, where we see despair in his eyes as he likely reflects on the deaths of Shalnark and Kortabi. I have seen the argument that he puts on a caring mask to sell his grief to his troop members to strengthen their trust in him, but this can easily be debunked because in every scene where Chrollo is mourning, there isn't a single troop member present. In fact, the opposite tends to be true. When he's with the rest of the troop, he tries his best to be rational and calm, because that's what's needed from a leader. So it's clear that Chrollo harbors feelings of love for the members of the Spider, but the most significant question here is about the characteristics of that love. What is the nature of his love for the troop members? Does he love them just because he truly cares for them? Or is there another reason for this attachment, an explanation that goes a long way towards revealing just the type of person he is? The straightforward way to think of the man is that he loves his troop members as he would care for a best friend or sibling. And given how vague of a character he is, this is totally valid and can't be disproven yet. But there is another way to look at Chrollo that not only makes him infinitely more interesting, but is also incredibly appropriate thematically. And this alternate explanation all comes down to the theme of identity, and how it relates to Chrollo. As I said earlier, Chrollo is relatively bland. He does show a passion for combat and he does let loose at times, but his characterization and personality are nothing to write home about, and I wouldn't begrudge anyone for thinking that he is somewhat boring as a person. But that is the point. He's a blank slate, with an identity crisis and no distinct sense of self. Not much is known about his past, but we do know that he is from Meteor City, a place for the abandoned, where the inhabitants have nowhere else to belong. Togashi has always been a writer that focuses on environmental factors in shaping who his characters become, and this is the case with Chrollo as well. So from a young age, Chrollo has always had an unstable sense of belonging. But as he grew up, this developed and manifested itself almost pathologically, so much so that Chrollo became unable to identify who he truly was. The reason is unknown, but this is pretty apparent, and even his powers hint at this. Nen is known to be a combat system that's very personal, because any given ability reflects the personality of the user through its elements. But what is Chrollo's ability? A power that specializes in stealing other abilities because he doesn't have the identity to conceive a unique power of his own. It's a distinct possibility that the name Chrollo Lucilfer is one that he made up for himself because he never had one in the first place. Simply put, he is a blank person. But this problem was even worse for him in his past, and this blankness used to be emptiness. It's very difficult to exist without an identity. It shapes who we are, how we act and conduct ourselves, what drives us, and subsequently, how we live. So Chrollo needed to find one desperately. And when one cannot create a sense of self through internal mechanisms, what do? They instead search outward, project, and latch on to some external thing that can make them feel whole. This is how the Phantom Troupe was created. Now, of course, a big reason for the Phantom Troupe's creation was to give its aimless members a place to belong. Chrollo was not without compassion, and he realized that through creating a group in which everyone had a family, a role, and a purpose, this would fulfill all of the members' needs. After all, he himself needed human connection and a place to belong, so he could easily relate to the situation of the members. But I think that for Chrollo, an even bigger motivation behind creating the spider was a much more selfish one: solving his identity crisis. Chrollo's biggest motivation in life is creating an identity and understanding himself, and in order to compensate for his lack of understanding, Chrollo formed the troupe. And he not only formed it, but he poured himself into it, quite literally from his perspective. From Chrollo's viewpoint, he is the spider. He is a man who is defined by the spider and seeks personal value through its actions. They are one and the same. Chrollo was so completely empty that he made his identity the Phantom Troupe itself. Due to this, he thinks of himself as less of an individual and more as an abstract entity that is the Phantom Troupe. Its existence validates his existence, and through its well-being, he thrives and has something to live for. This is why he places so much importance on jobs, rules, and structure, to ensure that above all, the spider survives. It's not just because he has pride in the symbolic resonance of what the spider stands for, it's that he feels that he is spiritually a part of it. It fuels his sense of identity, and since identity is what he values above all else, he wants to make sure that the spider lives on. So while Chrollo undoubtedly cares about his members, he uses them, along with the troupe as an entity, as a way of perpetuating self-recognition to interact with the world. One of the most unique and important things about Chrollo is that in a sense, the members act as parts of his identity, because they themselves are legs of the spider. It's a collective identity that is shared here, and it's doubtful that they're aware of this, but they surely wouldn't mind given how the troupe has enriched their lives. So if we adhere to this, we know that Chrollo thinks of his troupe members as not just close friends, but as parts of himself. He seems to be a character modeled after one of Togashi's other popular characters, Shinobu Sensui of Yu Yu Hakusho, who also had a severe issue with identity. But while Sensui's identity was shattered into 7 separate pieces within him, maybe Chrollo has a similar case of a collective sense of self, and just expresses it outwardly, pouring his identity into an external concept and a literal group of people. Now, with this in mind, we can go all the way back to the original question I asked earlier with a new mindset. What is the nature of Chrollo's love for the troupe members? He deeply mourns their deaths, but does he grieve because he truly loved them and was losing dear friends and family members? Or does he mourn because a part of himself, a leg of the spider, has died, lamenting at the fact that a piece of his identity has been destroyed? Was the stunning Requiem for Uvo an act that was simply mourning a lost friend, or one that also agonized at the loss of a part of himself, on a level so profound that there was no other way to communicate his pain other than destruction on a grand scale? I personally think of it as a mix of both, because he clearly cares for his brethren, but he also clearly uses the spider to absolve his identity crisis. And this subtle, underlying characteristic of Chrollo is not just significant because it adds depth and a very interesting element to his characterization, but because it provides extra justification for another aspect of him, his fearlessness of death. And understanding how these two characterization pieces integrate is key to fully understanding Chrollo. Towards the end of the York New arc, after capturing Chrollo to use him as leverage, Kurapika is unconvinced when Chrollo tells him that he's got no worth as a hostage. He just can't bring himself to believe that the leader of the Phantom Troupe seriously thinks that his own life is worthless, and he thinks that Chrollo is bluffing. However, after listening to his heartbeat, Melody confirms that Chrollo is telling what he believes is the truth, and that he has no fear of dying.
死への不安、恐怖、何もないわ。死を受け入れている音。死を毎日そばにあるものとして享受している音。
Of course, there is the possibility that he just didn't feel any risk of death in that particular moment. As someone well versed in the potency of Nen, Chrollo believes in the reliability of Neon's fortune-telling, and her predictions made no mention of this kidnapping, so he deemed the situation to be completely insignificant. He also has a knack for reading people, and he could tell that Kurapika would not do anything that would put Gon and Killua at risk. So this logical outlook can account for Chrollo's lack of fear in the moment. However, independent from this specific situation, Melody says that he has accepted death and walks with it every day of his life. But why is this so? Why is he so unafraid of dying in general? Well, the straightforward and obvious answer relates to his upbringing. He grew up in a place where no one belongs and no one cares for you, a place where the prospect of death looms. He has probably been familiar with the risk of death from a young age, and he has been surrounded by death his entire life since then, so it's natural that he would be unafraid of it. But with a character that has so much underlying nuance, this explanation feels a bit too simple. Obviously, in looking for alternate explanations, there's always a risk of confirmation bias and reading into something that isn't there. However, I think there's more to this acceptance of death, and I think that it all relates back to Chrollo's identity. His internal situation in terms of his individuality makes accepting death completely easy for him. As touched upon earlier, since he created the troop and made his identity synonymous with it, Chrollo has structured the rules around it such that the survival of the troop as a collective entity is of utmost importance. The spider itself, rather than any individual member, is the main priority, and the group's complementary roles and principles are structured to ensure this.
雲では俺が頭でお前たちが手足。手足は頭の指令に対して忠実に動くのが大原則だがそれは機能としての話で生死での話ではない例えば俺が死んでも誰かが後を継げばいい場合によっては頭より足の方が大事な時もあるだろう見極めを誤るな俺の命令は最優先だが俺を最優先に生かすことはない生かすべきは個人ではなく
Because of these standards, Chrollo has secured that the Phantom Troop will continue to function even if he dies. And from the surface, this seems like a pretty selfless and honorable thing for him to do, but it's very possible that there are selfish motives behind this. If this group were to fall apart the minute their leader died, Chrollo's identity would fall apart with it. However, with the spider being ensured to survive no matter what, Chrollo ensures that the closest thing in the world to his identity is able to remain even if he dies. So in a sense, he isn't truly dead even if his heart stops beating. As such, not only is he okay with the prospect of death, but he actively encourages prioritizing the troop's well-being ahead of his own, if it ever comes to that. He desires this so badly that it has become the strictest of codes within the troop, and he expects this rule to be honored above all else. What's notable as well is that Chrollo's bigger picture philosophy is one that his followers also believe in. While there aren't as many hints to their sense of self, perhaps they too feel like part of their identity is within the spider itself. After all, they are desensitized to death, being all too willing to die for a greater cause. Though, of course, it could just be that they're so selfless simply because of love and loyalty. With regards to this, Chrollo himself encapsulates the self-fulfilling prophecy of the spider. He gives the members an identity and a place to belong through the spider, and in return, they strengthen the one thing that he identifies with, giving him a stronger sense of self and allowing him to live on. It's a give-and-take relationship. Yet, again, it must be stressed that he still cares for his members apart from his own self-interest. He wants to make sure of their own well-being and personal satisfaction, and he cares about their own interests very much. But to bring things back to the original point, Chrollo is not afraid of dying because he is the spider. As an individual person, he is just one part of his broader self. So his death is unimportant in the grand scheme of things. His will continue on within the spider, and he believes that he has drilled his followers, his legs, in a way such that if the head is cut off, another can grow back. Of course, him as an individual dying is a blow to his greater self, but he doesn't grieve for this because he is not losing a friend or sibling. And this is all part of what makes Chrollo so alluring as a character. Such a bizarre sense of self, hidden so far beneath the shadowy unknown of his persona that it isn't easy to tell who this man really is. But when you look at him this way, a lot of his actions, personality, and demeanor make sense, and strongly reinforce the themes of the York New Arc and the Phantom Troop. Along with harboring a subtly presented identity crisis, it's clear that Chrollo is tied to themes that are completely unique to him within the story of Hunter x Hunter, ideas that you'd probably expect more in a series like Berserk than this one. Simply put, Chrollo is a nihilistic believer in fate and causality, and this integrates with his identity issue to form the core of his characterization and the force behind so many of his actions. He believes that life events are entirely out of mankind's control and predestined by some sort of unknowable, omnipotent cosmic force. He believes that struggling against the tides of fate is meaningless and pointless, and he doesn't believe in the existence of free will. This is a form of determinism that Chrollo adheres to, and it explains so much about his behavior. As stated in the recent chapters of the manga, Chrollo believes that there are no differences between human beings and puppets. In describing his newly revealed Nen power, he says that the ability's owner was the Elder of Meteor City. Someone from the outside was going to attack the residents, so he turned his brethren into bombs and had them deliver a message. The Elder saw no great difference at all between humans and puppets. Well, I suppose I don't either. And this makes perfect sense if Chrollo believes that humans have no control of their future. If we have no free will and our lives are simply the results of uncontrollable forces, we are just playing out our roles with no purpose. In that sense, Chrollo reasons that there is no difference between humans and puppets. These deterministic beliefs are particularly telling with regards to his attitude towards those that he and the spider kill. Chrollo doesn't enjoy killing that much, but he clearly has no qualms with murder if the job calls for it, if his followers want to kill, or if he needs to kill. He has a very nonchalant attitude towards killing. He doesn't sadistically enjoy it like Phaeton or Hisoka do, but he also doesn't really care that he's ending the lives of others. And he has this distinct apathy because of his views on fate and humanity. For obvious reasons, he cares about the lives of his followers. But with regards to strangers, if humans are puppets with meaningless lives as Chrollo believes, then it's natural that he would feel no concern for their lives and no guilt in killing them, since there was no point to them anyway. However, on the other hand, he does find certain humans to be quite fascinating, frequently marveling at how interesting they can be. Because of his attraction to fate, individuals that act in a way to seemingly defy the destiny that seems set upon them fascinate Chrollo. For him, the only purpose of a human being is to carry out the roles that destiny has chosen for them. Yet some act like this isn't the case, and fight against this fate. And this fruitless struggle is something that puzzles and intrigues Chrollo. There's also a very subtle allusion to Chrollo's beliefs in predestiny through something that he says about Judas, who is commonly known as the man who sold out and betrayed Jesus in the Bible.
俺たちの中にユダがいるぜ。この中に裏切り者がいると。
いないよ、そんな奴は。それに俺の考えじゃ、ユダは裏切り者じゃない。
After Uvogin brings up the possibility of a traitor, a Judas, in the group, Chrollo says that Judas was not a traitor. And this line of his, while intriguing and mysterious, initially seems pretty innocuous, but it's actually completely appropriate that Chrollo would think this way about Judas. Since Chrollo believes that all in life is predestined, he would then also believe that Judas did not have the personal agency or free will to prevent himself from betraying Jesus. It was not his choice, it was out of his control, and therefore, he was not actually a true traitor. Now, both Chrollo's thoughts on fate and his fixation on identity converge to dictate one curious aspect of his strong desire to obtain a certain Nen power. During the York New arc, Chrollo takes a detour from the troop's current issues to obtain the Nen ability of the Mafia head's daughter, Neon Nostrad. Her power, Lovely Ghostwriter, allows her to predict the future through telling fortunes for people, and Chrollo found this ability to be incredibly enticing, so much so that he went through great lengths to secure it. Now, obviously this sort of power is one that basically anyone would love to have, but it represents something extra special to Chrollo. Since he believes that he has no free will and that the future is set, he has complete confidence in the accuracy of Lovely Ghostwriter. But the fact that Chrollo says that the fortunes told of the troops' fates were just one possible fate that can be avoided if the right path is taken, shows that while he believes in fate and predestiny, he also believes that there are multiple predestined paths that humans can walk, and that they're usually just unaware of the mechanisms that can switch their paths. This doesn't mean that he now thinks that humans are more than puppets, but it does mean that with lovely Ghostwriter, he can transcend his insignificance just a little bit and choose which predestined path to walk in order to avoid the most undesirable future. But the other main draw of lovely Ghostwriter to Chrollo is this. Since he has such a preoccupation with what his identity is, he seeks to understand the path that his life is on. Where is he going and what will he do? Knowing these things will help him solidify his sense of self in a way that not even the spider can. The spider provides him with identity, but as much as he values it, he's aware that this is not true self-comprehension. Even with the strange identity that he has achieved, Chrollo strives for more, for a complete truth that he has not yet reached. He is trying with all his might to get there, but he even admits to Gon and Killua that he is still not able to properly understand himself.
一つ聞きたいことがあるんだけど、なぜ自分たちと関わりのない人間を殺せるの？
白旗を上げた割に敵意満々といった顔だな。なぜだろうな。関係ないからじゃないか。いや、改めて問われると答えがたいものだな。動機の言語化か。あまり好きじゃないしな。しかし案外、いや、やはりと言うべきか。自分をつかむ鍵はそこにあるか。
He ponders Gon's question with much more thought than anyone really expects him to, because it strikes a personal chord with him. Why do they do what they do? Maybe the troop's actions could give Chrollo some insight to who he truly is. Or maybe there's no reason to it. Either way, he knows that he has not yet reached his complete identity and his truth yet, but knowing what is to come is a big step towards that. And that's why he was so desperate to obtain Neon's power. But this scene with Gon brings an important question to light that Chrollo himself doesn't seem to fully know the answer to. Why did the spider murder, pillage, and steal? Pure enjoyment is an obvious reason, but is there anything else? It's been said many times that material goods hold no value for anyone in the troop, so why do they do it? Well, Chrollo has plenty of reasons for living and continuing to carry out jobs with the spider. As a man without a true identity, the simple functioning of the spider is his saving grace. He desires to exist through interacting with the world through the spider, and the way that the spider interacts with the world is through the jobs that it carries out. In a sense, this is like a sort of maintenance of Chrollo's self-identification. While he does desire more, this is what truly makes Chrollo happy. The Phantom Troop can be thought of as a sort of twisted fulfillment of Chrollo's need to exist and identify, so a preservation of that is surely a goal of his, and stealing and killing is an easy way to do that. But if this is the case, it's not surprising that Chrollo couldn't find the words to articulate why they do what they do, because it's not an easy concept to talk about. It's also possible that through this accruement of material wealth, the troop are trying to benefit their hometown. Meteor City has been looked down upon and stepped on for years, so maybe the goal of the spider through this pillaging is to bring respect back to their home, and those who reside within it. But aside from these secondary priorities, it's clear that Chrollo's main goal, above everything else, is to truly self-identify in this world on a level that he has not achieved yet. There are three elements to Chrollo that are most important. Firstly, that he has a bizarre identity crisis that causes him to think of himself as the spider. Next, that he has a strong belief in fate and predestiny. And lastly, that if Chrollo had one goal, it would be to understand himself at the most intimate level possible. If these elements are kept in mind when observing Chrollo's actions, then he makes sense and is no longer shrouded in mystery. While there is plenty of background information lacking and no specifics given regarding why Chrollo is so unique, it is entirely possible to understand the person he is now, independent from all of the reasons behind how he became that person. He is a strange character, completely unlike anyone else in the series, but he isn't someone whose actions have no explanation and whose motives and thoughts can't be understood. Chrollo vs. Hisoka is one of the most intriguing ongoing conflicts in the entire series, but it's always been a relationship classified by two distinct perspectives. The first is Hisoka's attitude, which is simple. He just wants to have an intense fight with Chrollo to the death, because he's Hisoka. But Chrollo's perspective is much more layered, and it's not outwardly clear why he acts the way he does. However, with the aspects of Chrollo's characterization that we've established, we can also completely explain his behavior concerning our sexually charged psycho clown. It's pretty obvious from early on that Chrollo gives Hisoka an unusual amount of leeway to do whatever he wants. He is oddly forgiving of Hisoka's antics, and it almost seems like a bit of favoritism. The other members take note of this as well. While Nobunaga is probably correct in saying that Chrollo needs Hisoka's skills, I think that this too relates back to Chrollo's unique perception of his identity. As said earlier, all of the legs of the spider are part of Chrollo's identity, including Hisoka. So even though Hisoka does things that were looked down upon by the rest of the troupe, and even though he was suspected to be a traitor, Chrollo never stopped thinking of him as a piece of himself. Regardless of whether or not he acted appropriately, Hisoka is a cherished part of Chrollo's identity, and this explains why he's so forgiving of his antics. If the other members did the erratic things that Hisoka does, Chrollo would probably let them do so as well, because they're all parts of him. This can also be looked at from the determinist aspect of Chrollo, similarly to his thought process in assessing Judas. Since all things are out of human control and there is no free will from his point of view, Hisoka has no choice in the matter, so naturally Chrollo is very lenient. And there is another element to the Hisoka-Chrollo relationship that might be a contributor to this leniency. Chrollo finds Hisoka incredibly interesting. This much is obvious just from his general demeanor towards him, but he says this as well during the beginning of their battle in Heaven's Arena. After telling him that he has no chance of beating him, Chrollo asks Hisoka if he still wants to continue with the fight. Obviously, Hisoka says yes, and his response makes Chrollo reflect once again on how fascinating humans are. But why? As you might expect, once again this is about Chrollo's deterministic worldview. Given that Chrollo has told Hisoka with 100% certainty that he will lose, Chrollo cannot comprehend Hisoka's willingness to fight anyway. It sort of relates to why he finds certain humans to be interesting. Both they and Hisoka fight and struggle, knowing that it is not going to yield any reward. But Hisoka's idea of a reward is far from traditional, and he takes this to an extreme, actively trying to find situations that could lead him into his death. In a sense, his intentions are opposite from everyone else's, almost embracing the prospect of death as Chrollo does, but in a completely different way. Hisoka's crazed passion for this is totally inappropriate and out of place in a world that follows a planned flow of events, and Chrollo is struck by this and admires it. However, despite all of this, it seems that Hisoka has crossed a line through his constant desire to destroy Chrollo, and even more so through his murders of Shalnark and Kortapi, so Chrollo probably does not feel the same way anymore. It's very hard for him to deal with the idea that a part of himself has committed so much self-harm, and it must have taken a huge toll on him to come to terms with this sort of internal conflict. This wasn't always the case, but it is now completely obvious from where we are in the manga that Hisoka is the greatest possible threat to what Chrollo holds most dear. Whereas before, Chrollo could deal with Hisoka's fixation on him because he could handle him and he wasn't scared of death anyway, Hisoka has now shifted targets to Chrollo's only two weaknesses: his connection to the only family he has, and his sense of identity. Hisoka is now going after each individual troop member, with the goal of taking the spider apart piece by piece in mind. To Chrollo, destroying the troop is far worse than killing him. Through this, Hisoka is not only killing Chrollo's loved ones, but destroying all of the aspects of Chrollo himself that he's projected onto his followers, which is literally the worst thing that can happen to him at this point. It's not clear as of yet whether Hisoka shifted his approach because he realized this, but it is possible. And this all signals great promise for the future chapters of the manga. Chrollo is as unhinged and agonized as he's ever been, and with Hisoka dead set on continuing his extermination, and Kurapika on the boat as well, things are sure to come to a head soon due to the foundations that were set by this character. By crafting Chrollo the way he is, Togashi has made it so that there is an extra dimension behind his situation, even more impetus to defend his creation, and even more focus on why the troop is literally life-saving for those within it. And this all strengthens the themes of perspectivism that define the story beats of the York New arc, while also causing a cascade effect through his design of the spider that shaped the moral landscape of future developments in the series. After forming the Phantom Troop, Chrollo did not proclaim himself to be head. He did not seek leadership. Instead, his comrades nominated him for the job themselves, because while they were not clued into his internal struggle, they sensed this aura of conviction and purpose surrounding him. It was obvious that he was just like them, that he needed this as badly as they did, and that he would do whatever it took to protect it. Chrollo accepted their decision as his fate, and this drew them further into his aura. The subtle little moments are what make Chrollo what he is. A melancholic stare, a shed tear, a strange quote. They're all aspects of his characterization that can't be explained independently at first, and as such, they add up to make him a character that you can't quite put your finger on initially. Without them, he'd come off as quite run-of-the-mill, but with them, he's elevated. And while the interpretation of him put forth in this video is one that is pretty unorthodox and abstract, at heart, it is actually quite simple. In conceiving Chrollo Lucilfer, Togashi has created a deterministic leader of a bunch of murderers in a complex and unfamiliar internal identity struggle. This is a character who shouldn't really be relatable to the vast majority of Hunter x Hunter's audience. And yet, the way that all of these aspects integrate make him someone that is incredibly easy to identify with and understand, because in spite of all the murdering, the stealing, the cruelty, and the strange rhetoric, the true essence of Chrollo still peeks through. And at the rawest level, Chrollo is just a person who's truly at peace when he's with his loved ones, the people who literally and metaphorically complete him. He's struggling to find a role in the world, desperate to understand himself, and desiring a true purpose and identity. Why was he put on this earth? Who is he? These are questions that most people ask themselves, and these are the questions that Chrollo has been trying to answer his entire life, the questions that mean more to him than nearly anything in the world. But they are at risk of forever being unanswered, and the only people in the world that matter to Chrollo threaten to be taken away from him. How far will he go to hold on to what he loves and so desperately needs? What will he do to keep himself whole? Will he finally try to fight against his fate to protect himself? These questions will be answered in the future, and I suspect that they will add even more pieces to the puzzle that is Chrollo Lucilfer. Thank you for watching.
鎖ね。なんでだろうな。
地獄に繋いでおかねばならないような連中がこの世で野放しになってるからだろう。